Hello and welcome to the Sharpening Report. I am your host, Josh Peck. Sorry, I just had to make sure we were actually recording. All right, so today we are going to be talking about the most amazing historical prophecies that the ancient Essenes held to, how they were proven true, and even some future ones that point to our time today. So, for those not familiar, the Essenes were a sect of Judaism that existed during the time of Christ and claimed to held onto the original Jewish religion the way it was supposed to be observed. The priests, called Zadok priests of the Essenes, believed of the Essene belief system existed in the area today called Qumran, yet there were Essenes themselves all throughout Israel. So they were known to have 100% accuracy in their prophecy, and that's what we're going to look at today. It's very exciting stuff, and I'm glad that you're here to join us. First, a word from our sponsor. Concerning the economically unstable times that we live in, it is a great idea to convert some of your savings into real money. Now, there is a big difference between real money and what we call money, which is actually just currency. So our dollar is currency, which fluctuates. Real money, on the other hand, like silver, for example, is a store of value over time. The best way to think of it is like this. If you had saved $1,000 in cash back in the late 60s, the late 1960s, that $1,000 would still be $1,000 technically, but it would buy you significantly less today due to inflation. Now, if you had saved that same $1,000 in silver back in the 1960s, today it would be worth around $28,000. So one of the best ways to protect your purchasing power is in real money, more specifically, silver. You can buy and have the metal shipped discreetly to your door, and what most people don't know is that you can actually convert your IRA or even a 401k into physical silver rather than having all of your life savings tied up in the paper fiat system, which is subject to hyperinflation. Go to dailyrenegade.com and click on the Cornerstone Assets Metals banner. This is the only company that I personally trust with this kind of thing. Click on that and sign up to get your free silver report today. One of the financial experts will speak with you to find out the best way to protect your savings going forward in these uncertain times. Okay, so let's start off with the prophecy of the lunar calendar, because this helps explain a lot. We're given the basic reason for why the Qumran community originally left behind their previous lives in Israel in favor of creating a new society in Qumran. So at the time that they left, the temple leadership and government had become so corrupt, following ungodly desires rather than the will of God, that the true believers in God had no choice but to leave. They also believed they were directed to do this by the guiding of the Holy Spirit in order to fulfill the prophecy about being a voice crying in the wilderness that would pave the way for the coming Messiah. Quote, this actually comes from their writings from the Rule of the Community 8:12b through 16a. This is from the Dead Sea Scrolls. And when these exists as a community in Israel, in compliance with these arrangements, they are to be segregated from within the dwelling of the men of sin, to walk in the desert in order to open there his path. As it is written, in the desert, prepare the way of God, straighten in the step a roadway for our God. This is the study of the law which he commanded through the hand of Moses, in order to act in compliance with all that has been revealed from age to age, and according to what the prophets have revealed through his Holy Spirit. Okay, end quote. So the individual who immediately comes to most minds when reading this passage is John the Baptist. This is typically followed by the question, was John the Baptist part of the Qumran community? I did talk a lot about that in my book, Lost Prophecies of Qumran, which you can find on Amazon and elsewhere. I don't want to get too much into it here because I do have other videos on that, and also it's not really it's prophetic in the sense that there was a prophecy about him that we just read. But in short, for many reasons, yes, most likely John the Baptist was part of the Qumran community, was in Essene. So let's deal with the rest of the backstory that led to the creation of the Qumran community and the eventual discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in our modern time. Because the reason that they left was actually prophesied as well in the Book of Jubilees. So another issue that led up to the split between the future Qumran community and the Pharisees was the change from a solar to a lunar calendar. Now, opinions on the history concerning how this came to be are kind of split. Some assume it was Antiochus IV Epiphanes who ordered the change from a solar to a lunar calendar, and others say that it occurred after his death. And at that time, a new ruler named Antiochus V Eupator came into power and ruled the Seleucid Empire from 164 to 61 BC. Now, some believe that during this time, the Maccabees accepted a deal where the Jews could keep their religion, but they had to use the Seleucid Empire's preferred lunar calendar. However it may have happened, there clearly was a point when the Jewish leadership accepted use of a lunar calendar, and the individuals who would later form the Qumran community believed this to be a grave, grave sin. They believed it so deeply that throughout the Dead Sea Scrolls, they referred to themselves as the sons of light, the legitimate priests following the solar calendar, and they referred to those who abandoned the solar calendar as the sons of darkness, illegitimate priests following the lunar calendar. And in fact, a prophecy from a book that was discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls described how certain Jews would abandon the solar calendar God gave them in favor of a pagan lunar calendar. So this is the Book of Jubilees, 6:36 through 38. It says, "For there will be those who will assuredly make observations of the moon, how it disturbs the seasons and comes in from year to year 10 days too soon. For this reason the years will come upon them when they will disturb the order and make an abominable day, the day of testimony, and an unclean day, a feast day, and they will confound all the days, the holy with the unclean, and the unclean day with the holy, for they will go wrong as to the months and Sabbaths and feasts and jubilees. For this reason I command and testify to thee that thou mayst testify to them, for after thy death thy children will disturb them, so that they will not make the year 364 days only, and for this reason they will go wrong as to the new moons and seasons and Sabbaths and festivals, and they will eat all kinds of blood with all kinds of flesh." Okay, so according to the Qumran community, God commanded that his solar calendar of 364 days must be used to ensure that all the festivals and rituals would be held on the correct day. By the way, we have recreated that calendar. It's very prophetic. You can use that calendar all throughout the entire Bible, and it fits. It fits perfect. It is a perfect biblical calendar, and it's been recreated, which I've done many videos on it at dailyrenegade.com. There's lots of videos there, and also we have a print version of that calendar available if you want to hang it on your wall, and it has the Qumran calendar, the prophetic Essene calendar, and then underneath it has the regular calendar too. So it's really easy to use, and you can match up the days and see. But I have a link for that in the description below if you're watching this on YouTube or Rumble. And there's also a link just at dailyrenegade.com for that calendar if you want to check that out. But it is an absolutely perfect prophetic calendar. It answers a ton of stuff in Revelation, Daniel, stuff like that. And like for example, one of the big debates is, do the two witnesses come in the first half of the tribulation or the second half? And when you compare it with the calendar, because there's a lot of clues in those prophecies about the two witnesses, there's a lot of day counts and stuff. You know, for however many days they're going to be doing this and doing that. When you add all that up, you find out that it has to be in the first half. And that's really interesting. I do write about that more in the book, and again, it's called Lost Prophecies of Qumran, which you can find on Amazon or skywatchtv.com in their store. But it's really interesting stuff. So I don't want to deviate too much, but I wanted to explain a little bit about their calendar and why it was so important to God that they held on to this calendar. The Pharisees got rid of it. They didn't want to use it. They wanted to use this lunar calendar. So they lost a lot of their prophecy because of that. And actually, with the Pharisees, it got to the point where they didn't even believe prophecy was happening anymore. And with the Sadducees, it got so bad they basically didn't even believe in anything anymore, like an afterlife or angels or anything like that. So abandoning the calendar, we can see why that was so important to God, and that prophecy is amazing in Jubilees, because that's exactly what ended up happening. So in the Bible, God took this so seriously that if priests did not carry out the rituals exactly as they were supposed to be performed, God could strike them dead, and that did happen in the Bible. Now, even more chillingly, now this is interesting, the Talmud records all the high priests up to the time of the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. Now, according to the list, there were 18 high priests in the 400 years of the first temple before the change to a lunar calendar. So 400 years before the change to the lunar calendar, there were only 18 high priests. However, during the 420 years of the second temple, there were more than 300 priests. So here's a quote from the Talmud. The fear of the Lord prolongs days, and that is a reference to the first temple, which stood for 410 years, and in which only 18 high priests served, as it is written in the lists of the genealogy of the priests in the Bible. But the years of the wicked will be shortened. That is a reference to the second temple, which stood for 420 years, and in which over 300 high priests served. But the years of the wicked will be shortened. That is a reference to the second temple, which stood for 420 years, and in which over 300 priests served. So there's a theory that there was such an increase in the high number of priests because, at least in part, they weren't doing the rituals and the festivals on the correct day, and they kept dying because of it. This would have contributed to the reasons the Qumran community would have refused to use the lunar calendar. They wanted to honor God by maintaining use of the correct solar calendar. So that's really interesting. Let's talk about an Essene prophecy for Herod the Great. So by the time Herod became king of Judea, the Jews of all belief systems, so Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes, came to hate him. They despised his transgressions of the Mosaic law, the Greek style of his various building projects throughout Israel, and the fact that he was clearly behaving and ruling as a Roman king rather than a Jewish one. Now, interestingly, according to Josephus, an Essene by the name of Menahem was gifted by God with foreknowledge of the future and spoke a word of prophecy over Herod in his early life. Menahem once saw Herod as a child going to school and saluted him as king of the Jews. And at first Herod thought Menahem either confused him with someone else or was just joking, but Menahem reached out his hand, clapped him on the back, and said, quote, However that be, thou wilt be king, and wilt begin thy reign happily, for God finds thee worthy of it. And do thou remember the blows that Menahem hath given thee, as being a signal of the change of thy fortune. And truly this will be the best reasoning for thee, that thou love justice towards men, and piety towards God, and clemency towards thy citizens. Yet do I know how thy whole conduct will be, that thou wilt not be such an one. For thou wilt excel all men in happiness, and obtain an everlasting reputation, but wilt forget piety and righteousness. And those crimes will not be concealed from God at the conclusion of thy life, when thou wilt find that he will be mindful of them and punish thee for them. End quote. So Josephus records that at the time of the original prophecy from Menahem, the young Herod had no ambition to be king. However, years later, when Herod did eventually ascend to the throne, he sent out for Menahem to ask how long his reign would be. Menahem answered a bit vaguely, saying, yes, 20 years, nay, 30 years. So Herod was satisfied enough with this answer and sent Menahem away. Josephus states that after that, Herod continued to honor the Essenes. Josephus concludes this account by saying, quote, we have thought it proper to relate these facts to our readers, how strange soever they be, and to declare what hath happened among us, because many of these Essenes have, by their excellent virtue, been thought worthy of this knowledge of divine revelations. End quote. Now, apparently, the original prophecy did come true early on. Herod may have started out decently. However, over time, he became more and more corrupt. He certainly forgot about piety and righteousness, and his crimes could definitely be looked at as offensive and punishable by God. And in fact, Herod would eventually die of a horrible illness after slaughtering the infants of Bethlehem, and we get that from Matthew 2:16 through 18, in an attempt to destroy the future king of Israel and Jewish Messiah, Jesus Christ. And that is certainly not a good legacy for someone to have. However, that is what Herod is most remembered for today. There is also in the book of Enoch, the Apocalypse of Weeks, and I actually did an entire video on this recently, so I don't want to rehash all of it, but if you want the full video, you can head on over to dailyrenegade.com and you'll be able to find it there. But basically, the book of Enoch splits up all 7,000 years of human history into 10 weeks, with each day being 100 years. And this has predicted things like the coming of the Messiah, the Protestant Reformation, and even the return of Jesus, which is supposed to occur in the 9th week. Now, the amazing thing about that is we, right now, are almost right in the middle of the 9th week. The exact halfway point in the 9th week is the year 2025, so not much further to go. Now, to learn why the midpoint is important and everything else about the predictions of Enoch's 10-week prophecy, check out my video entitled Enoch's Apocalypse, How Many Weeks Are Left, TSR 330. There is a free version on YouTube and Rumble, but you know, it's limited. So to get the full version, because that's like only the first half that you get for free online. But if you want all the information, you want to see the whole video, then you'll want to get a subscription to Daily Renegade at dailyrenegade.com. Okay, so let's talk about the War Scroll prophecies. Now, this one gets into some future stuff, and we may have to speculate a bit, but it's fascinating anyway. The contents of the War Scroll are unique and descriptive. It seems to detail a final end times battle between the righteous, legitimate priests called the Sons of Light and the wicked, illegitimate priests called the Sons of Darkness. And the light and darkness imagery likely is not only to communicate a spiritual truth, but also, as we said, refer back to the solar and lunar calendar difference between the two groups. So, as stated earlier, according to the Dead Sea Scrolls, the illegitimate priests followed a pagan lunar calendar, while the sons of Zadok they followed the solar calendar given by God from the beginning of creation. And again, if you want a copy of that calendar, there's a link in the description below, or just go to dailyrenegade.com. Now, in the War Scroll, angels are also participating in this war, siding with the Sons of Light. They are fighting by praying, worshiping, and blowing trumpets. And we see the spiritual warfare side of the battle with these angels alongside the physical warfare side of the battle with the human agents. Physical and spiritual warfare are occurring at the same time within the same final prophetic end times war. So already we can picture Old and New Testament passages explaining the end times battle of Armageddon that is set to occur at the return of Jesus Christ. Now, amazingly, quotes from the War Scroll may appear in the New Testament. So right after the Sons of Light win the war against the Sons of Darkness, the War Scroll states, "And the sons of justice shall shine in all the edges of the earth. They shall go on illuminating up to the end of all the periods of darkness." And that's the War Scroll 1:8a. Now, in the Gospel of Matthew, where Jesus is explaining the parable of the tares in which the sons of the wicked one are likened to tares among wheat, which are the righteous ones, he says that angels as well as humans will be involved in this battle. When the battle is won for the side of the righteous, he says, quote, "Then shall the righteous shine forth as the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Who hath ears to hear, let him hear." And that's Matthew 13:43. So the events of the War Scroll and the events of the end times battle as detailed by Jesus go hand in hand and appear to refer to the same battle, even using some of the same descriptions. So it's possible that Jesus was actually quoting the War Scroll there. We have a similar reference to this in Daniel 12:3, which says, "Those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the firmament, and those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever." So this at least shows the commonality between the War Scroll and the Christian interpretation of end times prophecy, though one could argue that Jesus and the writer of the War Scroll were both quoting from Daniel. That could be it. And that line of reasoning, in my opinion, is not as strong because the verse in Daniel has several elements, wise, firmament, etc., that are different from the War Scroll and the Matthew passages. But even though all three passages refer to the same generic prophetic period, it makes more sense since Matthew and the War Scroll have far more similarities, and since the War Scroll was written before Matthew, that Jesus, as recorded in Matthew, may have been quoting the War Scroll directly. Jesus may have been quoting from the War Scroll in this verse, and if true, that leads us to wonder how many of his followers would have been familiar with the War Scroll and other Dead Sea Scrolls. Perhaps the texts kept at the library in Qumran were far more well known during the first century in Israel than most would think today. And by the way, shining, that term seems to have to do with when our bodies are changed, when we're raptured. Could have, when we're in our glorified bodies, could have something to do with it. It seems like that's what it has to do with. Now, even more, the last line in the Matthew passage describing the hearing of those who have ears might be a signal to pay special attention. Something bigger may be at play here. A mystery may need to be discovered. And when Jesus was recounting how the world or age would end, we must remember there were three main schools of thought. There was the Pharisee, Sadducee, and Essene. And these three interpretations of eschatology certainly did not agree, and they were very different. There's no doubt that Jesus's listeners would have been wondering which interpretation was correct, just as we might wonder which modern prophetic interpretation is correct if Jesus was giving us a parable today. If he was referencing the War Scroll here, that may have been a way for him to say the Essene interpretation is correct. Basically, if you're willing to accept it, pay attention to what I'm saying because it falls in line with Essene theology. But if you've already decided to reject Essene interpretation, then you will not be open to understanding what I'm telling you. Like that kind of thing. Now, another way that the War Scroll is similar to the words of Jesus recorded in the Gospel of Matthew is in its description of this future time. So the War Scroll 1:11b through 12a says, "It will be a time of suffering for all the people redeemed by God. Of all their sufferings, none will be like this from its haste until eternal redemption is fulfilled." Now that sounds like the tribulation. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus says, "For then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be." And that's Matthew 24:21. So that sounds very similar. It's interesting that both the War Scroll and chapter 24 of the Gospel of Matthew record that this will be a time of suffering, not just for wicked people, but for those redeemed by God, called elect in Matthew 24:22. And in fact, according to the War Scroll, this final battle, which is probably Armageddon, since it appears only the unfaithful are slain in line 8 of column 3, lasts a lot longer than we typically think. So this is what it says. This is the War Scroll 2:9b through 10a. During the 35 years of service, the way will be prepared during 6 years, and all the congregation together will prepare it, and the war of divisions will take place during the remaining 29 years. So, could the 6 years be the first 6 years of the tribulation, with the Battle of Armageddon beginning in the 7th year and continuing for 29 more? As we saw in the book, when we looked at the book of Enoch's Apocalypse of Weeks prophecy, there was a 6-year difference between the middle of the 2nd week and the birth of Noah. And if you want more information on that, check out that video. So if week 9 has the same thing happening, could these 6 years of preparation described in the War Scroll account for it? We typically think that when Jesus returns, he will take care of everything at that exact moment. However, when we read through the prophetic texts of the Bible, as I do in my book, Lost Prophecies of Qumran, quite extensively, we discover that the timing is not so simple. If the end of the age, and we've talked about this a lot on this channel, there's many videos about it, and this goes back to the Essene prophetic calendar and their view of ages. So, according to the Essenes, if the end of the age occurs in 2075, our year, 35 years before that is 2040. So if the tribulation were to begin in 2040, 6 years to prepare the war would bring us to 2046. Then 29 years after that would be 2075. Now, we don't really know from biblical texts alone exactly how long this battle lasts. If it is a longer battle, however, it would stand to reason there would be a sooner rapture. So, for example, if the rapture were to occur, say, in 2025, just hypothetically, not trying to set dates, there could be another 15 years until the tribulation officially begins in 2040. We don't know how much time is between the rapture and the start of the tribulation, but I do explore that, again, a lot in my book, Lost Prophecies of Qumran. Now, all of this is contingent on the war scroll describing the Battle of Armageddon, which we have no real way of knowing if it is or not. It could be Armageddon, could be Gog and Magog, the final battle after the 1,000th year of Christ, some other war, whether biblically prophesied or not, something else entirely, or a combination of some or all of these. We don't even know if these 35 years in the war scroll are meant to be understood as consecutive or split into different sections with lengths of time in between. So this is how the 70 weeks of Daniel are described. So it is possible the same kind of thing is happening in the war scroll. It could be telling of many wars throughout Israel's history and future, for all we know. While not knowing might be frustrating for some, for me, it's actually kind of exciting. It opens up new possibilities to explore. While we may not know exactly how many, it doesn't seem that the war scroll. It does seem that the war scroll refers to at least two different battles. Now, in my opinion, it doesn't only reference the Battle of Armageddon, but also the battle at the end of the 1,000-year reign of Jesus, when Satan is let loose from his prison in the abyss and is then finally done away with forever. We can see this expressed in another passage of the war scroll that has commonalities with the New Testament. So this is the War Scroll 11, 16 through 17. You shall carry out sentence on Gog and on all his gathering, for you shall wage war against them from the heavens. Now, for those of you who know the book of Revelation, that's going to sound really similar to something. Now, the War Scroll right after this relates that God has the names of his followers in a book, which will be, again, important in trying to identify which end times battle is being described. So the book of Revelation, and keep in mind, the War Scroll was written at least 200 years before the time of Christ. And the book of Revelation was written somewhere around the year 90, somewhere around there. So you have at least nearly 300 years between the War Scroll and the book of Revelation. So listen to how similar this sounds. This is the book of Revelation. I'll read that one from the War Scroll again, then I'll read Revelation. So from the War Scroll, again, it says, you shall carry out a sentence on Gog and on all his gathering, for you shall wage war against them from the heavens. And then right after that, it talks about God having the names of his followers in a book. So now Revelation says, and when the 1,000 years are expired, Satan shall be loosed out of his prison and shall go out to deceive the nations which are in the four quarters of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them together to battle, the number of whom is as the sand of the sea. And they went up on the breadth of the earth and compassed the camp of the saints about and the beloved city, and fire came down from God out of heaven and devoured them. That's Revelation 20, 7 through 9 KJV. So it sounds very similar. First, we can point out the similarities in these passages. When we look to the book of Ezekiel, we don't find all the elements in Revelation. So this leads us to ask where John, the writer of Revelation, might have been pulling some of these references from. Now, of course, God is showing all these things to John in a vision, so it could just be as simple as that. However, if John was familiar with the War Scroll, he may have already been aware of these elements and may have pulled from them to help explain what he was seeing. It's like if he already knew the War Scroll, he could be thinking like, when he's in the vision, like, I see that, I know that, that's written about in the War Scroll, and then he could decide to word it similarly when he's writing it down. But that could suggest why we don't see elements from Revelation in Ezekiel, but we do find those elements in the War Scroll. Now, opinions are currently split on whether Gog and Magog war in the book of Ezekiel is the same as the Battle of Armageddon. Others have posited that the Gog and Magog war might be the same as the one after the 1,000-year reign of Christ. Some believe it is one or the other, or even a different war entirely. However, Ezekiel aside, it does seem these specific passages in Revelation, and the War Scroll are both talking about the battle after the 1,000-year reign of Christ. In the War Scroll and Revelation, we see mention of Gog, a gathering of enemy forces around the righteous, and God fighting against the wicked from heaven. Also, at this point, we can be confident that the War Scroll is referencing the battle after the 1,000-year reign of Christ, and no longer the Battle of Armageddon, because of the mention of a book of names right after describing the judgment of God from out of heaven against the enemy. So the War Scroll 12:2 says, "You have established for yourself in the book of the names of all their armies is with you in your holy dwelling, in the dwelling of your glory." Now, in the book of Revelation, right after the verse about God sending fire down to destroy the enemy, we are given a description of the great white throne judgment, which also mentions books and names. So Revelation 20, verse 12 and 15 says, "And I saw the dead, small and great, stand before God, and the books were opened, and another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged out of those things which were written in the books according to their works. And whosoever was not found written in the book of life was cast into the lake of fire." Now, given the same progression of mention in both passages, first the fighting of God against the enemy from out of heaven, then the book and the names, we can safely assume these two passages describe the same events: the battle at the end of Christ's millennial reign, followed by the reading of the book of names at the great white throne judgment. So this means the War Scroll seems to be accounting for at least two wars: the Battle of Armageddon and the final war after the 1,000-year reign of Christ. Other wars could be included as well, so we can't be too dogmatic about using this text to try to pinpoint the length of time between the rapture, tribulation, return of Christ, and the beginning of the kingdom age. Let's talk about next the Melchizedek document and the arrival of Messiah. This one's really interesting. So the writers of the Dead Sea Scrolls were awaiting the Messiah. However, their view of who he would be and what he would do was quite different than that of other Jewish sects of the time, Pharisees and Sadducees. So to show what the Essenes were looking for in the Messiah within the context of their calendar and the understanding of ages that we've talked about in other videos, we can look at some of their. And for those who aren't familiar, it's just basically how they split up time. How we have decades and centuries and millennia. Well, they did have a specific length of time called an age, which was 2,000 years, and they believed that there would be 4 ages, but the last one was a half age. It was a Sabbath, and that each of these 1,000-year periods, so each age would be like 2 days on a week calendar, if every day was 1,000 years. And yes, that most likely is what Peter was talking about when he says 1,000 years with the Lord's like a day, and a day like 1,000 years. They believe the totality of human history would be 7,000 years. And according to their calendar, we're coming up pretty close on what's supposed to be the start of the next age, the millennial reign. So we have plenty of videos like that at dailyrenegade.com if you want more information. But let's look at some of the Essenes writings from the Dead Sea Scrolls that still exist today. So there's a really interesting document called 11Q Melchizedek, or the Melchizedek document. And this is found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it's believed to have been written at the latest around a century before the birth of Jesus. And that's at the latest. Wouldn't be any later than that. Very well could be much older than that, but at least 100 years before the birth of Jesus. It accurately predicts the arrival and death of the coming Messiah right down to the exact year, and uses the Essene calendar and the understanding of ages in human history to explain it. So they had years. They had Shemitahs, which were 7 years. They had Jubilees, which were 50 years. Then, of course, they had 100 years, and then they had an Ona, which is 500 years, and then an age, which was 2,000 years. Okay, so this is what it says. And as for what he said, Leviticus 25, sometimes it references other books and verses in the Bible and stuff, but it says, and as for what he said, Leviticus 25:13, in this year of Jubilee you shall return each one to his respective property concerning it, he said, Deuteronomy 15:2, This is the manner of the release. Every creditor shall release what he lent to his neighbor. He shall not coerce his neighbor or his brother, for it has been proclaimed a release for God. Its interpretation for the last days refers to the captives who and whose teachers have been hidden and kept secret, and from the inheritance of Melchizedek. And they are the inheritance of Melchizedek, who will make them return. And liberty will be proclaimed for them to free them from the debt of all their iniquities. And this will happen in the first week of the Jubilee, which follows the 9 Jubilees. And the Day of Atonement is the end of the 10th Jubilee, in which atonement shall be made for all the sons of light and for the men of the Lord of Melchizedek over them, according to all their works. For it is the time of the year of grace of Melchizedek and of his armies, the nation of the holy ones of God, of the rule of judgment, as it is written about him in the songs of David, who said, Psalm 82:1, Elohim will stand in the assembly of God in the midst of the gods he judges. And about him he said, Psalm 82:2, how long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? Selah. 11Q Melchizedek 2 through 10. That's the end of it. So that was 11Q Melchizedek 2 through 10. Now, as with many of the other Dead Sea Scrolls, this might be a bit difficult to read, and that probably sounded a little janky, me reading it like that. But again, we have to remember that it's written this way because these texts were found in fragments and had to be reconstructed over time, so there's little pieces missing here and there. But that aside, what we learn here is stunningly accurate and even comes across as incredibly Christian, even though it was written no later than 100 BC. So according to the writer of this text, we first learn that the law of Moses in Leviticus and Deuteronomy points to the coming of Messiah. Jesus himself said as much while contending with unbelievers in John 5:46. For had ye believed Moses, ye would have believed me, for he wrote of me. The biblical passages quoted in the Melchizedek document are interpreted as having to do with the last days when the Messiah will free the captives from their debt of their iniquities. So in other words, he will forgive sinners of their sins. And that would have been not the last days the way we think of it, but like the last days of their age. The end of the age of Torah came around 70 AD. It was actually 75 AD, but it was around there. But yeah, so in other words, he'll forgive sinners of their sins. The passages say this will happen in the first week or the first 7 years of the Jubilee, the 50-year period that follows the 9 Jubilees. So once 9 Jubilees have passed, in the first week of the 10th, is when this is supposed to happen. Now, remember, there are 10 Jubilees to a 500-year Ona cycle. So the writers were talking about the Ona that they were in at the time of the writing. So that's why they worded it that way, after 9 Jubilees. So this is near the end of this Ona. And additionally, they were in the final Ona of their age. So this is the 10th. So this 10th Jubilee would have been the final Jubilee of their age, the final 50 years. So when we use their calendar, keeping in mind we already we can calculate the beginning of creation to 3925 BC, meaning the beginning of their age would have been in 1925 BC. Then we find out their age would have ended in 75 AD. So this means the final Jubilee of their age, or the 10th Jubilee, or the Jubilee which follows the 9 Jubilees, that began in 25 AD. So now we only have to add the first week, which is a week of 7 years, or a Shemitah, and we arrive at exactly 32 AD. Now, did something happen in that year that resulted in the sins of humanity being forgiven? Of course, the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. And it's just amazing that it's that stunningly accurate, right down to the exact year. And again, this was prophesied over at least 100 years before Jesus was born. Next, The Melchizedek document says that the end of the 10th Jubilee will begin the year or the age of grace, which is what we would call the church age today. Now, piecing this together, it appears that the true believing Essenes knew the Messiah would be God incarnate and come to forgive the sins of the repentant by dying and initiating a final age of grace before his triumphal return that will begin the millennial reign. Even more, the Melchizedek document connects the Messiah with the Elohim who judges in the assembly of God, the divine council, for those who are familiar with the work of Dr. Michael Heiser. Also, while we're on the topic, and just as a brief note based on the work of Dr. Michael Heiser, we can confirm the date of the birth of Jesus with the Melchizedek document as well. Dr. Heiser, as well as many others, have proposed September 11th, 3 BC as the date of Jesus' birth. Based on the Essene calendar, if we assume both Jesus' death at Passover of 32 AD as described by the Melchizedek document and passages from the Gospels of the New Testament, and his birth on September 11th of 3 BC, all we have to do is calculate the time between, and we arrive at 33 and a half years. And that is the age many have come to believe that Jesus was when he died, because he started his 3.5-year ministry at age 30. So according to Dr. Heiser, September 11th, 3 BC is the day the astronomical alignment mentioned in Revelation 12, which describes the birth of Jesus, occurred, and therefore is the most likely date for the birth of Jesus, which is absolutely fascinating. So all of this connects, it all corroborates each other, and it's just fascinating to see. So as mentioned earlier, the Melchizedek document states that the Messiah will set free the captives of sin. We also see this in the book of Isaiah. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because the Lord hath anointed me to preach good tidings unto the meek. He hath sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison to them that are bound, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all that mourn, to appoint unto them that mourn in Zion, to give unto them beauty for ashes, the oil for joy of mourning, and the garment of praise for the spirit of heaviness, that they might be called trees of righteousness, the planting of the Lord, that he might be glorified. And that's Isaiah 61, 1 through 3. So we see a direct quote of part of this passage by Jesus in the Gospel of Luke, and this is Luke 4, 16 through 21. And he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and as his custom was, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day and stood up to read. And there was delivered unto him the book of the prophet Esaias, which is Isaiah. And when he had opened the book, he found the place where it was written, The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he hath anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He hath sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to preach deliverance to the captives, and recovering the sight to the blind, to set at liberty them that are bruised, to preach the acceptable year of the Lord. And he closed the book, and he gave it to the minister, and sat down, and the eyes of all of them that were in the synagogue were fastened on him. And he began to say unto them, This day is this scripture fulfilled in your ears. So this means the individuals following the teachings, doctrines, and prophecies found in the Dead Sea Scrolls expected that the Messiah would come to forgive sins. Now, amazingly, they knew this long before Jesus was born. We as Christians are usually taught that no Jew understood what the Messiah would come to do, and that he took everyone by surprise. But as it turns out, that's not the case. The importance of this really cannot be overstated. At least one major school of thought in Israel during the time of Jesus, and even before, recorded in the Dead Sea Scrolls, understood exactly what the Messiah would be doing when he came, and Jesus fulfilled their expectations. Now, getting back to the words of Jesus as recorded in the Gospel of Luke, note that Jesus stopped quoting Isaiah mid-sentence, right before the part that says, and the day of the vengeance of our God. Now, he did this because it is the exact breaking off point between the first coming of Jesus and his second coming. It will be upon his return that the rest of the Isaiah passage will be fulfilled. In the Melchizedek document, we see the same type of thing. It specifically says that at that point, the age of grace, our current church age, will begin. It does not say that this will be the time of the vengeance of God. Therefore, it seems that the writers and keepers of the Melchizedek document understood the Messiah would come in two stages. First, to set the captives free from their iniquity, in other words, forgive them of their sins. And second, later, to judge the wickedness of evildoers. Now, I do develop that deeper in my book, The Lost Prophecies of Qumran, if you want to check it out. But going along with the idea of Melchizedek, Hebrews, in talking about Jesus, states, and this is Hebrews 5, 9 through 10, and by being perfected in this way, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him, and he was designated by God as high priest in the order of Melchizedek. So it seems unlikely that it would be a coincidence that both the Dead Sea Scrolls and the author of Hebrews equate the Messiah with Melchizedek in some way. It seems entirely more likely that this understanding isn't new to the book of Hebrews. The writer of Hebrews may have been drawing from an older line of interpretation recorded in the Melchizedek document and other scrolls held by the Qumran community. Remember, the Melchizedek document says, it is the time for the year of grace, which just means age of grace. It is the time for the age of grace of Melchizedek. And according to Christian theology today, we would say that we are living in the time of the church age, or age of grace of Jesus Christ. So to me, that is far too similar a description to be a coincidence. The authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls had an expectation of a Melchizedekian Messiah, and the book of Hebrews is explaining to the Jewish audience of the time how that expectation has been fulfilled in Jesus Christ. So absolutely fascinating stuff. Yeah, we'll do one more. Well, we're actually going to do a lot more, but in this free version, we're going to do one more. The Aramaic Apocalypse and the Birth of Jesus. So another similarity between the Dead Sea Scrolls and the New Testament appears in a scroll called the Aramaic Apocalypse, or the Apocryphon of Daniel, or a vision of the Son of God. And this was also written at least 100 years before the birth of Christ, and it seems to give a familiar description of the coming Messiah. He will be called Son of God, and they will call him Son of the Most High. It's Aramaic Apocalypse 2:1a. Now compare this with the words of Gabriel to the soon-to-be mother of Jesus, Mary. He will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High, and the Lord God will give him the throne of his father David. So the parallels between these two passages are striking, yet are not without controversy. The Aramaic Apocalypse was first published in 1974, and at first scholars largely agreed that this was referring to a coming messianic figure. Later, a theory developed that this Son of God was a villainous figure, possibly the Antichrist. Some even took it further and said that it was describing Antiochus IV Epiphanes, which, if true, would mean this text was not prophetic, but instead describing an event that had already taken place. Given the future tense language, the Antiochus IV Epiphanes interpretation seems unlikely. However, the future Antichrist understanding may still be valid. It all depends on how we render the text surrounding the passage in question. So, and again, keep in mind these are fragmented, so pieces are taken out. Aramaic Apocalypse 1:5 through 2:3. And great slaughter in the city, king of Assyria and Egypt, and he will be great over the earth. They will do, and all will serve. Great will he be called, and he will be designated by his name. He will be called Son of God. They will call him Son of the Most High. Like the sparks of a vision, so will their kingdom be. They will rule several years over the earth and crush everything. A people will crush another people, and a city another city. Now, whether the Son of God identification belongs to the Messiah or the Antichrist depends on how we interpret their kingdom. If we connect it with the one who is great over the earth and look at Son of God as a description of that ruler, then we have a description of the Antichrist. If we instead see Son of God as an introduction to a new person entirely, or possibly even as an extension of the ruler over the earth, but we see the king of Assyria and Egypt as a different person, then it might be describing both the Messiah and the Antichrist. The problem is we're missing some context since it's so fragmented. We don't know if in the missing parts the subject of the description stays the same or changes to a new person. And you might wonder, why would the Antichrist be referred to as the Son of God? Well, we don't know which God this is talking about. It could be a false God, or it could be the real God. We're missing some context. Now, one more piece of evidence we can look at concerning the future Antichrist is from the book of Daniel, which states, "And the king shall do according to his will, and shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak marvelous things against the God of gods, and shall prosper till the indignation be accomplished, for that is determined shall be done. Neither shall he regard the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor regard any God, for he shall magnify himself above all." So clearly the Qumran community would have been familiar with the book of Daniel, as copies of it were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. If the Son of God in the Aramaic Apocalypse is referring to a future Antichrist figure, it would seem to contradict the description given in the book of Daniel, since there he is said to be exalting himself above every god and speaking blasphemies against the true God. Therefore, this leads me to lean toward believing the Aramaic Apocalypse is calling the Messiah Son of God rather than a future Antichrist or Antiochus for Epiphanes. However, as is usually the case with these issues, opinions are split and there is no consensus on how this should be interpreted. Okay, so we still have to get to the halakhic letter and the end of days, the Psalms of exorcism and the book of Revelation, and the Messianic Apocalypse, all of which have very important prophetic significance, but we're going to save that for members only. So if you're not a member, head on over to dailyrenegade.com, get a membership if you don't have one already, and you'll be able to watch the whole video there. Members not only get full videos, not available anywhere else, a necessity we had to start doing because of censorship and shadow banning, but also you'll get early releases of all our videos. Sometimes even 2 weeks in advance. So by now, the time you're watching this on YouTube, members of Daily Renegade have already had access to this video for 2 weeks. Memberships are only $10 a month or $100 a year, and I suggest the $100 a year because then you're essentially getting 2 months for free. If you are a member, hang on the line, and everyone else watching for free on YouTube or elsewhere, thank you for joining me. Until next time, take care, God bless.